At my son's wedding, they gave my seat to a trash can, Ashley said with a laugh, loud enough for the table to hear. It's just a joke, Margaret. Don't be so dramatic. I didn't respond right away. I just stood there, holding the small ivory place card between my fingers, staring at the name printed in elegant script, my name, resting neatly against a polished silver trash bin at the edge of the reception table. For a moment, I thought there had been some kind of mistake. The ballroom was beautiful, glowing under warm chandeliers, filled with soft piano music and a low hum of conversation. White roses lined every table, and crystal glasses caught the light like tiny stars. It was everything I had imagined for Daniel's wedding, everything I had quietly helped pay for. I looked around, expecting someone, anyone, to notice, but no one moved. A few guests glanced at me, then quickly looked away. Others smiled politely, as if this were part of the evening's entertainment. Ashley adjusted her dress, flawless and radiant, her smile wide but sharp at the edges. Come on, she added, nudging Daniel lightly. Tell her she's overreacting. My son didn't meet my eyes. He let out a small chuckle, the kind he used when he didn't want to get involved. Mom, it's just a joke, he said, shrugging. Don't take it so seriously. Just a joke. I nodded slowly, as if I understood. As if I hadn't just been placed beside a trash can at my own son's wedding. I pulled out the chair next to it and sat down carefully, smoothing the fabric of my navy dress over my knees. The metal lid of the bin reflected a distorted version of my face, older than I remembered, quieter than I felt. No one offered to switch seats. No one suggested moving the place card. The waiter passed by and hesitated for half a second before setting down a glass of water in front of me, right beside the trash can, as if it belonged there. I folded my hands in my lap and kept my posture straight. Across the table, Ashley was already laughing with her bridesmaids, her voice light and effortless. Daniel leaned in close to her, whispering something that made her smile even wider. From the outside, it looked like a perfect wedding, the kind people would talk about for years. Elegant, joyful, seamless. I glanced down at my phone resting quietly in my clutch. For a brief second, I considered taking a picture. Not for revenge. Not yet. Just to remember. Because something about this moment felt important. Like a line had been crossed so quietly that no one else even heard it. I lifted my eyes again and studied the table. The carefully arranged centerpieces. The gold-trimmed plates. The handwritten place cards that guided everyone exactly where they were meant to be. Everyone had a place. Except me. Or maybe this was my place now. I exhaled slowly and reached for my glass of water, taking a small sip. It was cold. Steady. Real. Unlike everything else in the room. It's just a joke, Ashley had said. I repeated the words silently in my mind, turning them over like something fragile that might break if I pressed too hard. A joke requires laughter. A joke ends. This didn't feel like either. I sat there, beside that quiet, gleaming trash can, and for the first time that evening, I stopped wondering if I was being too sensitive. Instead, I started wondering how long this had been happening without me noticing. And more importantly, why? I stayed in that chair longer than I should have, long enough for the music to swell and for the first round of toasts to begin, long enough for the room to settle into its rhythm without me ever truly being part of it. And the strangest thing was how quickly everything around me adjusted, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. As if a woman sitting beside a polished trash can at a wedding reception was perfectly acceptable as long as she did not speak up about it, as long as she smiled politely and kept her hands folded in her lap, which is exactly what I did, because I had spent most of my life learning how to make other people comfortable even when I was not. I watched as Daniel stood to give his speech, tall and confident, his tuxedo fitting him perfectly, his voice steady as he thanked everyone for coming. And when he mentioned family, his eyes moved across the room, but never quite landed on me. Not even for a second, not even by accident, and I felt something shift inside my chest, not sharp or sudden but slow and quiet, like a door closing in a house that had once been full of light. The guests laughed at his jokes and raised their glasses when he asked them to. And beside me, someone dropped a crumpled napkin into the bin. The soft sound of it landing echoed louder in my ears than the applause that followed his speech. I turned my head slightly and saw a woman across the table glance at me before whispering something to the man next to her. They both smiled in that careful way people do when they are pretending not to stare, and I realized then that this was not invisible. It was simply unspoken. I reached for my purse and rested my hand on it, grounding myself in something solid, something that belonged to me. And for a brief moment, I considered standing up and walking over to Daniel, asking him quietly if this had been his idea, if he had known, if he had agreed. But I already understood the answer without needing to hear it, because silence can be louder than words when it comes from someone who once called you his whole world. The dinner service began shortly after, plates placed neatly in front of each guest, the scent of roasted chicken and herbs filling the air. And when the waiter reached me, he hesitated again, just for a second, before placing my plate down with the same careful precision. As if trying to convince himself that this arrangement was normal, I thanked him softly and picked up my fork, even though I was not hungry. Even though the food might as well have been paper for all the taste it had. Across the room, Ashley moved from table to table, greeting guests, accepting compliments, her laughter bright and effortless. And every now and then she glanced in my direction, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for me to understand that she was watching, measuring, waiting to see if I would react, if I would give her something to justify the words she had already used. Against me, dramatic, sensitive, difficult, I kept my expression calm, my movements slow and deliberate. I took a sip of water, set the glass down, adjusted the napkin on my lap, small actions that felt almost ceremonial in their steadiness, because the truth was beginning to settle into place in a way I could no longer ignore. This was not spontaneous. It was not careless. It was not a harmless joke that went too far. It had been arranged, planned, printed on a place card, and set down in advance. And that meant someone had made the decision ahead of time that this was where I belonged. Not just Ashley, but anyone who had seen that card and said nothing. Anyone who had helped set the table and did not question it. Anyone who had noticed and chosen to look away, including my son. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the edge of my plate before I relaxed them again, breathing in slowly, letting the air fill my lungs and steady my thoughts. Because if there was one thing I understood in that moment, it was this. Whatever this was, it did not begin tonight, and it would not end here either. And for the first time since I walked into that ballroom, I was no longer asking myself whether I was imagining things. I was asking myself how far back this pattern really went, and how much of my life had quietly shifted without me ever being told. The rest of the evening unfolded in a way that would have seemed ordinary to anyone who was not paying close attention. And that was precisely the problem, because I began to notice how easily something extraordinary could be hidden inside something that looked perfectly normal. The clinking of glasses, the soft laughter, the gentle hum of conversation, all of it blending together into a kind of background noise that allowed certain things to go unquestioned. And as I sat there, still beside that same quiet metal bin, I started to remember other moments, small ones at first, moments I had dismissed at the time because they did not seem important enough to hold on to. Like the Sunday afternoon 6 months ago when I arrived at Daniel and Ashley's house with a pie I had baked from scratch, only to find that they had already finished lunch without telling me. Ashley smiling as she said, "Oh, we thought you might be busy," even though I had confirmed the time with her the day before, or the Christmas morning when my gift had been set aside until the very end, opened quickly and without much attention while the others exchanged more elaborate presents. Ashley laughing lightly as she said, "You know how it is, we save the simple ones for last." And I had laughed too, because it seemed easier than asking what she meant by simple. And then there was the time Daniel had mentioned they were thinking about moving, a bigger house, something more modern. And when I offered to help with the down payment, Ashley had placed her hand gently on his arm and said, "We want to do this on our own," her tone warm but final, and I had respected that. Even though I knew exactly how much Daniel was still paying off from his student loans I had co-signed years ago without hesitation, because that is what mothers do. They step in where they are needed, and they do not keep score. But sitting there now, with the weight of the evening pressing quietly around me, those moments began to line up in my mind like pieces of a pattern I had never fully seen before. Not loud enough to demand attention, not cruel enough to justify confrontation, but consistent enough to slowly shift the ground beneath my feet. And I realized that what had happened tonight was not an isolated incident. It was simply the most visible version of something that had been building for a long time, something subtle and deliberate, wrapped in politeness and softened by humor, always just enough to make me question myself instead of them. to wonder if I was misreading the situation, if I was expecting too much, if I was becoming, as Ashley liked to say, a little sensitive. I watched her again from across the room as she leaned in close to one of her friends, whispering something that made them both laugh. Her posture relaxed, confident, completely at ease in a space she had clearly made her own, and I could not help but notice how naturally she moved through it, how easily people responded to her, how quickly she had become the center of everything, and for the first time I allowed myself to consider a thought I had avoided until now, that perhaps this had never really been about a single joke or a single moment. Perhaps it had always been about redefining where I stood in this family, quietly, gradually, until there was no space left for me that felt natural or earned, only spaces that had to be assigned, controlled, or, as I had just experienced, reduced. I picked up my phone then, not drawing attention to the movement, and angled it slightly as if I were checking the time, but instead I captured the image in front of me, the place card, the polished surface of the bin, the carefully arranged table setting that surrounded it. I did not look at the photo right away. I simply let the phone rest in my hand for a moment before slipping it back into my purse, because something about preserving that image felt important, not as proof for anyone else, but as a reminder for myself, a way to hold on to the clarity that was beginning to form, the understanding that this was not confusion or coincidence, it was intention. And as that understanding settled more firmly into place, I felt a shift inside me, subtle but unmistakable. The kind of shift that does not announce itself with anger or tears, but with a quiet decision, a decision to stop explaining, to stop minimizing, to stop pretending that what I felt was not real. And as the music changed and guests began to move toward the dance floor, I remained seated for a moment longer, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my posture unchanged, but my perspective no longer the same. Because for the first time that evening, I was not thinking about how to endure the rest of the night. I was thinking about what I would do after it ended. The music grew louder as the evening moved forward, shifting from polite background melodies into something more celebratory, something that invited people out of their seats and onto the dance floor, and one by one the guests responded, chairs sliding back, laughter rising, the atmosphere loosening in a way that made everything feel lighter, except for me, because I remained exactly where I was, still seated at the edge of that carefully arranged table, still beside the same quiet reminder of where I had been placed. And as I watched Daniel take Ashley's hand and lead her toward the center of the room, I found myself remembering another dance floor, another time, when he was barely tall enough to reach my waist, his small hand gripping mine as he insisted on practicing for a school recital in our living room, stepping on my feet more often than not, laughing every time he did, looking up at me as if I were the most important person in the world, and I had laughed with him then, never once imagining that there would come a day when I would be sitting in a room full of people who all seemed to agree, without saying a word, that I no longer belonged in that same place in his life. I shifted slightly in my chair, the soft fabric brushing against the metal of the bin beside me, and I noticed how easily people moved around it, adjusting their steps without acknowledging it, the same way they adjusted around me, polite, careful, distant, as if proximity required caution rather than warmth. And that thought stayed with me as I watched Ashley tilt her head back in laughter, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's shoulder, her presence effortless, practiced, secure. She did not look like someone who was unsure of her place. She looked like someone who had defined it, shaped it, claimed it fully, and for a long time I had told myself that this was natural, that families change, that new dynamics form, that stepping back is part of growing older. But what I was seeing now was not a gentle shift. It was a quiet replacement, not announced, not discussed, just carried out through a series of small decisions that, taken together, had redrawn the boundaries of where I stood. I thought about the house Daniel grew up in, the one I had held on to for years longer than I probably should have, because I wanted him to always have somewhere to come back to. The same house I had eventually sold when he and Ashley mentioned they were struggling to find something in their price range. I had told myself it was the right thing to do, that helping them start their life together mattered more than holding on to walls filled with old memories. And I remembered the way Ashley had thanked me at the time, her voice warm, her smile sincere, or at least it had seemed that way. And now, sitting here, I wondered how much of that moment had been genuine and how much had simply been convenient. I exhaled slowly, letting the noise of the room fade just enough for me to hear my own thoughts clearly. Because clarity, I was beginning to understand, does not arrive all at once. It builds quietly, piece by piece, until it becomes impossible to ignore. And what I was seeing now was not just a single evening gone wrong. It was a pattern of decisions that had gradually shifted me from the center of my own family to the edge of it, from someone who was included to someone who was accommodated, and finally to someone who could be dismissed under the cover of humor. I reached for my glass again, taking another measured sip, my movements steady, controlled, because there was a certain dignity in not reacting the way they might expect, in not giving them the moment they might be waiting for, the raised voice, the visible hurt, the confirmation that their quiet narrative about me was correct, that I was difficult, that I made things uncomfortable, that I did not know how to take a joke. Instead, I sat there, composed, observant, letting the evening reveal itself fully. And as the music carried on and the dance floor filled, I felt something settle inside me with a calm I had not anticipated, not anger, not sadness, but something quieter, something more deliberate, a recognition that while I could not change what had already been done, I could decide what came next, and that decision, I realized, would not be made in this room, not in front of these people, not under these lights. It would be made later, in a space where I could think clearly, act carefully, and finally stop questioning whether what I had seen and felt tonight was real, because now I knew that it was. It was sometime between the second dance and the cutting of the cake when I noticed her watching me again, not directly, not in a way anyone else would recognize, but with that same brief, measuring glance she had used all evening, as if she were checking whether something had shifted, whether I had reacted, whether I had understood the role she had quietly assigned to me. And I realized then that this was not just about exclusion. It was about control, about defining the narrative before I ever had the chance to question it. And as that thought settled in, another memory surfaced, clearer than the others, sharper somehow. The afternoon Ashley first came to my home, years ago now, standing in the doorway with that same poised smile, her voice soft, her tone respectful, telling me how much Daniel had spoken about me, how important I was to him, how lucky she felt to be joining our family. And I had believed her, not because I was naive, but because I wanted to believe that the love I had given my son would naturally extend to the person he chose to build his life with. I had welcomed her without hesitation, invited her into my kitchen, shown her the recipes Daniel loved, listened to her stories, supported her plans, and over time I had begun to step back, just slightly, in ways that felt reasonable, healthy even, letting them make their own decisions, build their own traditions, create their own space. But now, sitting here, I could see how each of those small steps had not simply been about giving them room. They had been about removing myself from the picture altogether, one decision at a time, until there was almost nothing left of the place I used to hold. I watched as the cake was brought out, a tall, elegant centerpiece of white and gold, and the room gathered around it, cameras lifted, voices bright, capturing the moment from every angle, and I noticed how easily I blended into the background of those photographs, standing just far enough away to be included if necessary, but not close enough to matter. And it struck me then how carefully this distance had been maintained, not through confrontation, not through anything that could be pointed to and named, but through a series of choices that always seemed reasonable on the surface, until they were viewed together, until they formed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. I shifted slightly in my seat, and felt the cool edge of the bin brush against my arm again, a quiet reminder that even now, even in this moment of celebration, my presence had been reduced to something that could be placed, adjusted, and explained away with a simple phrase, just a joke. And I found myself thinking about how often that phrase had been used, not just tonight, but before, in smaller ways, softer tones, moments that seemed too insignificant to challenge at the time. A comment here, a gesture there, always followed by a smile, always framed as harmless, until the line between humor and intention became so blurred that questioning it felt like overreacting, like failing to understand something everyone else seemed to accept. Without hesitation, I folded my hands together again, resting them lightly in my lap, and allowed myself to sit with that realization without rushing past it, because there was something important in seeing it clearly, in naming it silently, even if I did not speak it out loud. And as I looked across the room at Daniel, laughing with friends, his posture relaxed, his attention fully absorbed in the life he was building, I felt a quiet shift in the way I saw him, not as the child I had raised, not as the boy who once needed me for everything, but as a man who had made choices that had consequences, even if he did not fully understand them yet. And that understanding did not come with anger, not in the way I might have expected. It came with a kind of calm clarity that settled over me like a steady weight, grounding rather than overwhelming, because for the first time that evening, I was no longer trying to make sense of what had happened from their perspective. I was beginning to see it from my own, and that made all the difference, because it meant that whatever came next would not be about reacting to them. It would be about responding for myself, and that distinction, I realized, was where everything would begin to change. It was not until much later in the evening, when the music softened again and the crowd thinned slightly around the tables, that someone finally approached me. Not Ashley, not Daniel, but a voice I recognized from years ago, quieter, more careful. "Mrs. Collins," she said gently, and I turned to see Emily standing beside me, her expression composed, but her eyes carrying something more complicated beneath the surface, something that did not match the lightness of the room around us. She glanced briefly at the chair, at the place card, at the bin, and then back at me. And in that brief exchange of looks I understood that she had noticed, truly noticed, not just seen, but understood what it meant. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. And I gave the same small nod I had given everyone else that evening, the same quiet reassurance that required nothing further. But she did not move away. She did not pretend. Instead, she pulled out the chair on my other side and sat down, leaning slightly closer as if what she was about to say needed to remain contained. "I was there earlier," she said softly, "when they were setting up the tables, and something in the way she said it made my attention sharpen, not outwardly, not in a way that would draw notice, but internally, with a focus I had not felt all evening. I thought maybe it was a mistake at first," she continued, her fingers tracing lightly along the edge of the tablecloth. "But Ashley laughed about it with the planner." She paused then, just long enough for the words to settle before adding, "She said you would not mind, that you would sit anywhere." I did not respond immediately, not because I did not understand, but because I understood too well, the clarity of it settling into place with a kind of quiet finality that left no room for doubt. This had not been a careless oversight. It had not been a moment of poor judgment or an attempt at humor that had gone too far. It had been intentional, discussed, approved, placed deliberately before I ever walked into the room. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, because reacting now would not change what had already been done, and more importantly, it would not serve me in the way I was beginning to realize I needed. Emily watched me carefully, as if waiting for some sign, some indication of how deeply the words had landed. But I only nodded once, slowly, acknowledging what she had said without inviting further explanation. "I just thought you should know," she added, her voice softer now, almost apologetic, as if she were responsible for something she had only witnessed. I turned my head slightly toward her then and offered a small, genuine smile, not because I felt reassured, but because I appreciated the honesty, the simple act of someone choosing not to pretend. "Thank you," I said quietly, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the sounds of the room filling the space between us, laughter, music, the clink of glassware, all continuing as if nothing had shifted, even though everything had. Emily eventually stood, resting her hand lightly on the back of the chair before stepping away, blending back into the crowd, and I remained where I was. But something inside me had changed in a way that felt both subtle and irreversible. Because there is a difference between suspecting something and knowing it, between questioning your perception and having it confirmed, and that difference carries a kind of weight that is difficult to ignore. I reached for my purse again, not hurriedly, not in a way that would draw attention, and this time I opened it, sliding my phone into my hand with a steadiness that felt almost automatic. I did not look at the screen. I did not check the image I had taken earlier. I simply held the device for a moment before placing it back, as if completing a small, private ritual, because the truth was, I did not need to see the photograph to remember what it represented. I had seen enough, heard enough, understood enough, and as I lifted my eyes once more to the room around me, to my son, to the woman he had chosen, to the carefully constructed celebration that had been built on decisions I was no longer a part of, I felt something settle into place within me. Not anger, not even sadness in the way I might have expected, but a kind of calm resolve, the kind that comes when confusion is replaced with clarity, when doubt is replaced with understanding. And for the first time that evening, I was not thinking about how to endure what remained of the night. I was thinking about what would happen after I left, and more importantly, what I would choose to do with what I now knew. The decision to leave did not come suddenly. It arrived the way everything else had that evening, quietly, without drawing attention, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to surface. And when it did, I did not hesitate. I simply reached for my purse, adjusted the sleeve of my dress, and rose from my chair with the same composed movement I had maintained all night. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going, and that in itself told me everything I needed to know. Because there was a time when my absence would have been noticed immediately, when Daniel would have looked around the room, searching for me, when he would have crossed the floor without a second thought just to make sure I was all right. But tonight, the space I occupied was so easily released that it felt as though I had already left long before I ever stood up. I walked past the table, past the carefully arranged centerpieces and the place cards that guided everyone else so precisely. And I did not look back at the chair, not because it no longer mattered, but because I had already taken with me everything it had shown me. The air outside the ballroom felt cooler, quieter, the distant sounds of music fading behind me as the doors closed. And for a moment I stood there, alone in the hallway, letting the silence settle around me, letting the weight of the evening shift into something more manageable, more defined. I moved slowly toward the exit, my steps steady, unhurried, as if I were leaving any other event, any other evening. And when I reached the glass doors, I paused just long enough to see my reflection staring back at me, composed, calm, unchanged on the surface, and yet I knew, with a certainty that surprised even me, that something fundamental had shifted, not in the way others might expect, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally, in a place that had nothing to do with how I appeared and everything to do with how I understood what had happened. I stepped outside into the cool night air and took a slow breath. The kind that fills your lungs completely, the kind that reminds you that you are still grounded, still steady, still in control of what comes next. And as I walked toward my car, I found myself thinking not about the humiliation of the evening, not about the words that had been said or the way they had been delivered, but about the choices that had led to that moment, the quiet permissions, the small allowances, the times I had dismissed my own discomfort in order to keep the peace, to avoid conflict, to maintain a version of family that no longer existed in the way I had believed it did. I unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat, placing my purse beside me. And for a moment, I did not start the engine. I simply sat there, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, looking ahead at nothing in particular, allowing my thoughts to settle into something clearer, something more structured, because clarity, I was beginning to understand, is not just about seeing the truth. It is about deciding what to do with it. I reached into my purse and took out my phone, this time opening it fully, letting the screen light up the quiet interior of the car. And I scrolled briefly until I found the image I had taken earlier, the place card, the bin, the table, all captured exactly as it had been presented to me. And I studied it for a moment, not with shock, not with disbelief, but with a kind of calm acknowledgement, as if I were looking at evidence that confirmed something I had already accepted. I did not delete it. I did not send it to anyone. I simply let it remain where it was, because I had a sense, a quiet but certain sense, that I might need it later. Not to prove anything to them, but to remind myself of what I had seen, of what I had finally understood. I locked the phone and set it aside, my hand lingering there for just a second longer before I withdrew it. And then, finally, I started the engine, the soft hum filling the space around me as I pulled away from the building, leaving behind the lights, the music, the carefully constructed celebration that had continued without me. And as I drove into the quiet of the night, I felt no urgency, no rush to resolve what had happened, because I knew now that whatever came next would not be immediate, it would not be reactive, it would be deliberate, thoughtful, precise, the kind of response that does not seek to match the moment, but to redefine it entirely. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not because anything had been fixed, not because anything had been undone, but because I understood, with complete clarity, that the story they believed they were telling about me was no longer the one that would define what happened next. The drive home was quieter than I expected, not heavy or overwhelming. Just still, the kind of quiet that allows thoughts to settle into place without interruption, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, I already knew that whatever came next would not involve confrontation, not in the way most people might imagine, because there was no value in arguing with people who had already decided what version of reality they preferred. Instead, I would let the truth unfold in a way that did not require raised voices or dramatic scenes. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, the faint ticking sound of the cooling car filling the space, and then I stepped out, walked up to the front door, and unlocked it with the same steady movement I had used for years. The house greeted me with a familiar stillness, the soft scent of lavender from the candle I had left burning earlier, the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, everything exactly as I had left it, untouched, unchanged, and that contrast between the chaos of the evening and the calm of this space made something inside me settle even further. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and moved slowly through the room, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, because every action now felt deliberate, considered, part of something larger than the moment itself. I reached for the folder I kept in the drawer near the sink, the one I had not opened in months, perhaps even years, and I set it down on the table, running my fingers lightly along the edge before opening it. Inside were documents I had once reviewed carefully and then set aside, trusting that they would not need to be revisited. Papers related to the sale of the house, the accounts that had been transferred, the investments I had consolidated when Daniel and Ashley were starting their life together. I had not thought much about them since, because I had believed, without question, that they had been part of a shared future, something built on trust, something that did not require constant oversight. But tonight had changed that perspective in a way that felt both sudden and inevitable. I sat down and began to read, slowly at first, then with more focus, more attention to detail, numbers, names, signatures, clauses I had skimmed before now taking on new meaning, and as I moved through each page, a realization began to take shape. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but clear, precise, undeniable. I had not given everything away, not entirely. There were still structures in place, still decisions that required my approval, still elements of control that I had assumed would never need to be exercised. And for a moment I paused, leaning back in the chair, letting that understanding settle into something solid, something I could work with, because this was not about revenge, not in the sense of causing harm or creating conflict. It was about balance, about restoring something that had been quietly taken for granted. I reached for my phone again, not to look at the photograph this time, but to scroll through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in a long while. Richard Lawson, my attorney, someone who had helped me put these structures in place years ago, someone who understood the details far better than I ever had. My finger hovered over the screen for just a second before I pressed the call button. The line rang twice before his voice answered, familiar, steady. "Margaret, it has been a while," he said, and I allowed myself a small, composed smile. "Yes," I replied calmly. "It has, but I believe it is time we review a few things." There was a brief pause on the other end, not of confusion, but of recognition, as if he understood immediately that this was not a casual conversation. "Of course," he said, his tone shifting slightly. More attentive now. "When would you like to come in?" I glanced down at the papers spread out in front of me, the signatures, the dates, the quiet evidence of decisions made long ago, and I answered without hesitation, "Tomorrow morning." And as I ended the call, placing the phone gently on the table beside the documents, I felt that same calm resolve settle deeper into place, not rushed, not emotional, but firm, because whatever they believed about me, whatever assumptions they had made, whatever role they had quietly assigned, they had overlooked something important, something that could not be replaced or dismissed or explained away as a joke. And as I gathered the papers neatly back into the folder, aligning each edge with care, I understood that what came next would not be loud. It would not be messy. It would not be something that could be easily dismissed. It would be precise, measured, and impossible to ignore. The next morning arrived without urgency, but with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar, as if the air itself had shifted into something more precise, more defined. And when I stepped into Richard Lawson's office just before 9 o'clock, I carried that same quiet certainty with me, not as a shield, but as a foundation. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a measured expression, the kind that comes from years of understanding that not all meetings are routine. And as we sat across from each other, the folder resting neatly on the polished surface between us, I did not rush into explanations. I simply opened it, turned it toward him, and said, "I would like to understand exactly what remains under my control." He did not ask why. He did not question the timing. He simply adjusted his glasses and began to review the documents with a focus that mirrored my own, page by page, line by line. And as the minutes passed, his expression shifted subtly, not dramatically, but enough for me to recognize that what he was seeing aligned with what I had begun to understand the night before. "Margaret," he said finally, looking up at me with a steadiness that matched my own, "you have significantly more authority here than I think you realize." I nodded once, not surprised, not relieved, simply acknowledging what had already taken shape in my mind. "Then I would like to exercise it," I replied calmly. And what followed was not a confrontation, not an emotional unraveling, but a series of decisions, deliberate and precise, adjustments to access, revisions to authorizations, safeguards that had always existed but had never been activated. Until now, we moved through each item methodically, accounts that required dual approval, properties that remained partially under my name, provisions that allowed for reassessment under certain conditions, and with each confirmation, each quiet clarification, I felt the balance shift, not outwardly, not in a way that anyone else could see just yet, but internally, where it mattered most, because this was not about reclaiming something lost. It was about recognizing what had never been fully given away in the first place. By the time I left his office, the morning sun had risen higher, casting a clean, steady light across the street. And as I stepped outside, I did not feel victorious. I did not feel vindicated. I felt prepared. And that distinction mattered more than anything else, because preparation does not rely on reaction. It does not depend on what others say or do. It exists independently, quietly shaping what comes next. I drove home at the same measured pace, the city moving around me in its usual rhythm, unaware of the shift that had taken place in a small office just a few blocks away. And when I arrived, I placed the folder back in its drawer, not as something to be hidden, but as something to be kept in order, accessible, ready. The phone call came later that afternoon, just as I had expected, Daniel's name appearing on the screen, his voice carrying a familiar mix of hesitation and assumption when I answered. "Mom, we noticed you left early last night," he said, as if the timing of my departure were the only detail worth addressing. I let a small pause settle between us before responding. "Yes, I did." My tone even, unhurried, and he continued, filling the silence in a way that suggested he had already decided how the conversation would go. "Ashley was worried you might have taken things the wrong way. You know how she jokes." I listened without interrupting, without correcting, without offering him the reaction he might have expected, and when he finished, I spoke just as calmly as I had throughout the entire conversation. "I understand exactly what happened," I said, and for a brief moment, there was silence on the other end, not long, but enough to register that something in my voice had not aligned with his expectations. "Well, good," he replied, a little too quickly, because it really was not a big deal. I did not argue. I did not disagree. I simply said, "We will talk soon," and ended the call before the conversation could settle into familiar patterns. Placing the phone down gently, I allowed myself a single, steady breath, because the truth was, there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to justify. They had made their decisions, quietly, confidently, believing they understood the position I held in their lives, and now, without raising my voice, without creating a scene, I had begun to make mine, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that would, in time, become impossible to overlook. And as I stood there in the quiet of my kitchen, the same calm settling around me once again, I realized that the seat they had chosen for me had not defined my place at all. It had simply revealed theirs, and that understanding, more than anything else, was where everything had truly begun to change.